The topic for today is Verdun. Now, Verdun was, in fact, the longest battle of the war, lasting from February 21st to December 18, 10 months. It was possibly the most consequential battle of the war. Certainly, many people feel it was for a variety of reasons. And it is odd for a consequential battle because there was very little accomplished. It was a bloodbath. It demoralized and partially destroyed both the French and the German armies. And there was no clear victor. Uh, and yet, from a strategic standpoint, it was terribly important. But to get started on Verdun, let us first be sure of where it is. It has come to my attention that not everybody knows where Verdun is. It's uh, east of Paris. It is on the border between mainland France and Alsace-Lorraine, so it's very close to the border of France in 1914. It has a number of significant features that make it central to the understanding of what went on in World War I. And let me start with a consideration of the Meuse River, which flows through Verdun. Now, Verdun at the present time is a sleepy little provincial town that has the main distinction that it was the site of the Battle of Verdun, or to be more accurate, the 1916 Battle of Verdun was fought around Verdun, although never really in Verdun. The Meuse River is somewhat unique among the rivers of northeastern France, and we'll get to that in a moment. The battlefield is still visible. You can see shell craters, you can see lines of trenches. The battle around Verdun has permanently scarred the landscape. And because the French regard this as sort of their central rite of passage during the war, they have actually made an effort to preserve portions of it so that we can see the effects on the landscape even today. The Meuse River is a large enough river so that even at the level of Verdun, it forms a major obstacle. You can't get across it in the face of determined opposition. So it forms a real barrier. Now, if you look at the river systems of France, there are a number of major rivers, the Loire, the Garonne, and of course the Seine. But the Meuse is different because it doesn't run through France and into the Atlantic or the North Sea or the English Channel. It goes into Belgium. Looking at it a little more closely, you can see that it actually runs very similar to the Moselle River and leaves France to go into Belgium about here. And from there, it goes on to take a rather curvilinear course through Liège and on into Holland, where it eventually goes into the North Sea. Now, you'll remember that Liège was one of the first targets of the German invasion of Belgium, so the Meuse River has actually been something that is an integral part of the World War. Verdun is down in the lower part of this picture, and you will notice that if you start in Germany and you simply go down the river, you eventually get to France, and you're not very far from Paris. In fact, it's a direct invasion route, and the Valley of the Meuse has long been recognized as a particular area of vulnerability for the French. It was, in fact, the path of the German invasion of 1870 and 71 that resulted in a humiliating defeat at Sedan, another city more or less along the path of the Meuse, and was a hinge of the 1914 German invasion. I'll show you that in a moment. The entire area is heavily fortified because it was recognized as being a major vulnerability as early as the late part of the 19th century. In fact, in French military parlance, it's actually not known as Verdun. Verdun sort of gives you the impression of this great walled city bristling with guns and surrounded by infantry. In fact, it was called the fortified region of Verdun, dotted with forts out to about 10 or 15 miles and protected by Fort Douaumont to the northeast, the biggest and heaviest fortification in the area. You can see in this map of the 1914 invasion that the Germans went through Belgium, they went through Luxembourg, they invaded north of Verdun into the Champagne countryside, but they didn't actually attack Verdun itself. The whole idea was to do a turning movement and trap the French army, and specifically to get around Paris. Now, we all know how that worked out for them. But notice this little salient south of Verdun. This was the remnant of German counterattacks during the so called Battle of the Frontiers, where the French tried to invade Lorraine between Verdun and Nancy and failed, winding up with a salient into the French lines at Saint Mihiel. More later. It's a little inaccurate to talk about the Battle of Verdun. In fact, there were battles near Verdun for virtually the whole war. First, the Battle of the Frontiers, as mentioned. The French in 1915 tried to take back Saint Mihiel and failed. They invaded, they had two offensives in the Champagne countryside, which is just north and west of Verdun, and they both failed. And then, of course, the Battle of Verdun in 1916. 1917, they had another go at the Champagne, the so-called Nivelle offensive, the only one of the major offensives that was named after a general, and it was a failed offensive. Perhaps they decided to put the blame on Nivelle rather than on Champagne. 1918, of course, the Saint Mihiel offensive was successful by the U.S. in retaking the Saint Mihiel salient. And then the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which you don't really realize until you think about it and look at it on a map, but that was just adjacent to Verdun. In fact, I'll show you where one of the major monuments to that offensive is, about 20 miles north and west of Verdun. Now, going back to this slide, this is what things looked like in 1914. I mean, in 1916. The Saint Mihiel salient is here. Verdun itself is a salient, surrounded pretty much on three sides to the northwest, the northeast, and the southeast by German forces. This is very important to understanding the conduct of the battle, and we will get to that. Now, the Western Front in uh, 1915 was the scene of several battles. The Second Battle of Ypres by the British, the Battle of Neuve Chapelle by the British, the Battle of Boucher, Champagne, and Somme Hill by the French, all of which failed. They didn't have enough artillery shells. They didn't know how to really do artillery in 1915. They didn't know how to attack a defended trench line. And the whole thing was just a mess. So in December of 1915, there was a conference in Chantilly to plan the coordinated offensives by the British, French, Russian, and Italians. These coordinated offensives were intended to break the Germans and the Austrians. French and British armies would unite around the Somme and pursue a joint offensive in that area. The Russians were going to do the same thing in Galicia and the Italian offensive on the Isanza. Of these, the only unqualified success was, in fact, the Brusilov offensive in Galicia, which did succeed in driving the Austro-Hungarian army back to the Carpathians. The Somme was pretty much of a stalemate, and we all know about the Isanza. The Somme offensive was originally conceived by Haig as a major attack around Ypres. Whether or not that would have been successful, Joffre wanted to do a combined French and British attack, and the decision was made to have a balanced offensive both north and south of the Somme. This was sort of dictated by the fact that that was where the French and British sectors joined and was the only real practical area to have a joint offensive. Originally, the French were going to provide maybe 50 to 60% of the troops, and the British less, because the British Army at this time was very poorly trained. They were mostly new recruits and people that had joined since the start of the war, where the French Army was much larger to begin with and had a much higher level of experience and a much higher number of experienced soldiers. But then came Verdun. The Verdun offensive by the Germans started on 21 February, totally upset the 1916 war plans. As the saying goes, the enemy will always screw up our plans. That's why we call him the enemy. So, the supreme commanders of this at this time were the French Marshal Joseph Joffre and the German General Erich von Falkenhayn. Verdun ended both of their careers as supreme commanders. Marshal Joffre was a classic French general. He was a tradesman's son. He had worked his way up through the army. He was a man of great personal ability and great personal size. He really liked his food. You can see here in this picture, there's Joffre, there's Haig making a point to Lord George. I'm not sure who this guy back here is. He may have been the referee. Lloyd George and Haig, I think it's fair to say that they did not like one another. It's probably fair to say that they hated one another. Anytime that Lloyd George could put Haig down, he did, and he had a tendency to take whatever Joffre said over whatever Haig said, which may explain Haig's posture in this particular picture. General von Falkenhayn was the commander-in-chief of the German armies, a classic Prussian aristocrat. He was an outstanding officer. Even after he was fired as commander-in-chief, they sent him to Romania to after Romania had declared war against Germany, and he managed to conquer Romania in about 6 weeks or 2 months. But whatever he was trying to accomplish at Verdun, he didn't. Let us talk about how the battle played out. The initial, well, the battlefield in general is dominated by a couple of different concepts. First off, adjacent to Verdun was a formation known as the Heights of the Meuse. Now, the Meuse Valley itself, as most river valleys are, was flat, frequently somewhat marshy in this area. But to the east, there was a region of hills, not quite mountains, but extremely rugged terrain that was known as the Heights of the Meuse. The German challenge was to get through that. The French had placed forts, batteries, and other defensive installations throughout the Heights of the Meuse, as well as around Verdun in general. So so the Germans had to work their way down the east bank of the Meuse, the part east of the Meuse, get through the Heights of the Meuse, and get to Verdun. And I remind you that once you're in Verdun, it's kind of flat terrain from there on to Paris. So were they able to do that, it would be a direct threat to Paris itself. On the West Bank, things were somewhat different. You have the Argonne Forest, which is the shaded area on this map. And next to that, you have a series of hills along the southern aspect of the Argonne Forest, which are easily defensible and which needed to be taken if the Germans were going to make it, were going to surround Verdun, which was kind of their idea to begin with. Verdun's is salient. If they can come down the west bank of the Meuse through the Argonne Forest and join up with their salient at Saint Mihiel down below here, then they've got it made. They've got Verdun taken. They've got the plains of eastern France before them, and they've got a pretty straight shot to Paris, which is only 100 miles or so away. So that's how things kind of were spelled out for the Germans. And they did a lot of preparation. Let's talk about that. They built 10 new rail lines into what was then their frontier. They constructed underground shelters so that they could keep troops in these underground shelters and nobody could see them. They were they didn't show troops marshaling that could be seen by airplanes, by spotter planes. They were fairly quiet about all of this, as quiet as you can be if you're going to bring in 6 Army corps. They had 4 corps, which 4 Army corps, each of 2 or 3 or 4 divisions, which were attacking, and then 2 more corps in reserve. All of this was under the 5th Army, which was the army that was actually going to do the work. Remember those corps, because in the German army, corps are semi-autonomous. The corps commander has a lot of discretion on how to attack and how to manage his assets. And this became important later in the battle. They moved in 1,200 guns with ammunition and were able to anticipate a huge artillery barrage with which they would start this offensive. And they planned to start it in the middle of winter. I mean, this was in February. They actually had to delay it for about a week because the weather was especially bad before they actually kicked off on February 21st. Now, the French, on the other hand, made preparations which at this distance are hard to understand, and even at the time were hard to understand. They decided that the forts were not an especially useful way of defending territory, so they converted to what was called a conventional linear defense, which means infantry in trenches using the forts and the existing batteries as strong points in a linear defense system. To do that, and for other reasons, they removed most of the cannons from the forts. Again, this is hard to understand. They didn't move in a whole lot of troops. As a matter of fact, Fort Douaumont had exactly 68 soldiers, all of whom were artillery soldiers, and 2 guns left in February 1916. There was no infantry, there were no trench lines around Fort Douaumont, there was no infantry out patrolling to look for threats, and there was no infantry available to even man the fort and defend it. Verdun was regarded as a quiet area and was not regarded as some place that was likely to be attacked. If that makes you think of the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, you would be exactly correct, because that also was regarded as a quiet area until the Germans mounted an offensive through it in 1944. Well, so the first phase started with what the Germans called Operation Judgment. I have no idea why that was considered an appropriate title. The artillery preparation involved 800 guns, 1,000,000 rounds, which is about the same as the preliminary barrage at the Somme, only they only took a day or two to do it. The infantry wound up attacking about 1,600 hours, and they advanced 5 kilometers by February 22nd. There was just too little opposition. Some On February 25th, some German soldiers that were patrolling in advance of the main body noted that they could get into Fort Douaumont, and they did through an undefended opening in the fort. And they kind of wandered around until they found these artillery soldiers, so they made them prisoners and basically just took over Fort Douaumont with hardly a shot being fired. Subsequently, there was a lot of controversy among the German army about who was actually responsible for taking the fort. A sergeant was actually the guy that first went into the fort and took the artillery people prisoners, but an officer that came along later happily claimed all the credit for it, and it took a while to sort all of that out. In any case, this was considered a major disaster by the French because they'd been bragging about how impregnable Fort Douaumont was, and yet it was taken by just a few German soldiers, almost in passing. One of the heroes of Verdun was Emile Driant. Driant was an interesting guy. He was actually a career Army officer, but he was very much out of favor at court. He was Catholic. He was kind of an independent thinker. He's a very bright guy. And at a certain point in his career, he realized he wasn't going to get promoted. So he quit. He became an author, wrote a number of books, several books in the genre of what are we going to do if the Germans invade, which was a popular genre among the French during the 10 years before the war. He also became a legislator, became a member of the chapter of the Council of Deputies, the French legislature, from Nancy, which is obviously in the same region as Verdun. He warned Joffre of the weakness in that area and was simply ignored. But because he was a politician and he was a legislator who had taken leave of absence to serve in the French army, he had access to the leadership of France. So he complained to Gallieni, who was at that time essentially the Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense. Joffre was infuriated by this, threatened to court martial Driant. Probably would have if Driant had survived. But in the event, on February 21st, he was commanding a couple of battalions of elite infantry in the Bois de Car, which is an area on the very perimeter of the fortified area of Verdun, about 10 miles north of Verdun itself. And he was killed there on 22nd February after his command post and his troops had been overrun, and he was retreating, trying to rally his troops, and was cut down. This is what his command post looks like today. I actually took this picture. I'm not 100% sure it's his command post, nor were the guides who were with us, but if it wasn't his, it was one very similar to it. And the French seem to believe that it's significant because they make a big deal of it. Well, at this point, the French army, what of the French army there was, trying to defend against 20 or 30 divisions of Germans, was in full retreat. They were the Germans were advancing rapidly. And you think about it, 5 kilometers in World War I was practically a dead run. And they continued for the next 2 or 3 days to advance further, to take strong points, and to threaten to occupy the heights of the Meuse and Verdun itself. So Joffre, in possibly the first intelligent decision he made regarding Verdun, wound up sending Henri Philippe Pétain to try to rally the defenses and organize Verdun so that it could be defended. Pétain himself was an interesting guy. He was a farmer's son. Again, in the French army, to be an aristocrat was a negative. To be the son of a tradesman or a peasant was actually a major advantage. He graduated from Saint Cyr and became a career military officer in 1880. But he was a Catholic and was not very much in favor. So in 1914, he made it up to colonel. He was not going to get promoted any further. At that point, of course, he was 58 years old and he was ready to retire. But he did well at the Marne, was breveted brigadier general, and then rose rapidly simply because he was one of the most able senior officers in the French army. So Joffre sent him in to command the Verdun defenses. He expanded the number of troops there from initially they moved in 20 divisions and eventually became 52 divisions in the area defending Verdun. He introduced a rotation system whereby no unit would have to stay in the line for a terribly long time. And it's estimated that close to half of the French army rotated through Verdun at one time or another in this rotation system. It minimized but did not eliminate the adverse morale factor of Verdun, and we'll talk about that in a little while. Probably as important as his rotation system and beefing up the number of troops, he established a supply system and organized a way of getting the supplies into Verdun, getting troops in, moving troops out, getting the wounded evacuated, and all of the various logistics things. And he organized what is known as the Rue Sacrée, or the Sacred Road. We'll have a discussion of the Sacred Road shortly, But it suffice to say that without Petain, Verdun would have fallen. His organizational skills and his attention to logistical detail saved Verdun from being overrun. Subsequently, he was then elevated to command of the central group of armies in April of 1916. That left Nivelle in command at Verdun, which initially looked like a pretty good idea. Subsequently, and we'll get to this later, he wound up replacing Nivelle as commander in chief in April and May of 1917, and he remained commander in chief of the French army for the rest of the war. He reestablished the French army after extensive mutinies caused by Verdun and by the failed Champagne offensive in 1917. His nickname in the public eye was the Lion of Verdun, the Lion de Verdun. Here's a picture of him down at the bottom on the left with Haig, Folk, and Pershing. So there he is in 1926, hero of France. Uh, he is, at this point, 70 years old and ready for a graceful and well honored retirement. Instead, he got involved in French politics. And he was active in various ministerial jobs. And when the Germans overran northern France and France essentially surrendered, he became chief of the French state under Nazi rule from 1940 to 44, first as deputy prime minister and then prime minister and then as head of the Vichy state. Now, at this time in 1941, if you've done your math, he is 85 years old. And this, as we have learned recently, it is probably not a real good idea to take on a major leadership role in your 80s. Be that as it may, he became known as a collaborator. He was sentenced to death after the war and imprisoned on an island outside of France, uh, dying in 1951 there at the age of 95. Charles de Gaulle served under him when he was a young officer, when Charles de Gaulle was a young officer, and thought very highly of him. Said in later years that many of the things that he had learned about leadership had been taught to him by Philippe Pétain. So let's let Charles de Gaulle have the last word on him. He was banal, then he was glorious, then he was deplorable, but he was never mediocre. Okay, so we go to the second phase of the Battle of Verdun. The first phase, from the 21st of February to the 6th of March, only lasts a couple of weeks. During the second phase, in March and April, the Germans consolidated their gains on the West Bank and resumed their attack. They fought over the hilly area to the northwest of Verdun, areas like Hill 304, Mortom, which is a plateau of about 2 kilometers in length that was fought over really for the rest of the year, Hill 365. They essentially never managed to take these areas. And the advances that they made in the first couple of weeks of their offensive remained their line for the rest of the battle. There's still a lot of fighting going on, but they never made it any further. On the East Bank, they continued and they made some more gains, but they actually failed to take the heights of the Meuse. Now, during this time, I mentioned the German corps commanders had a lot of autonomy. They continued to do the same thing that commanders in all the armies did, which is they would attack on a broad front with the idea of simply overwhelming their opposition. But by the time the French under Petain had gotten a lot of troops in and had set up a lot of defenses, gotten their supply situation straightened out, and brought in some artillery. The Germans had a hard time with this. If they had adopted more of a limited offensive technique, they probably would have lost fewer men and they might actually have done better. The bite and hold tactics advocated, for example, by Rawlinson of the British Army might have served the Germans well, but they didn't do that. They continued to attack on a broad front. They wound up being able to make small gains, but being unable to support them. And they slowly pushed down, but were unable to really break through. So this is not a very good slide. It's sort of blurry, but you can see that at this point, from you, you can see that at the bottom end of the slide is the Saint Mihiel salient, and the Germans have surrounded Verdun, but have not yet broken through the defenses. During the third phase, first off, as mentioned, the French changed commanders. By promoting Petain to the Army Group Center and putting Nivelle in the command job at Verdun, they essentially had the best of both worlds. They kept Petain, who was charged with supporting the things going on at Verdun, was supporting all of the operations, because this was the major operation in his area. At the same time, they had Nivelle, who was a considerably more aggressive commander in charge of working out how to do counterattacks and beginning counterattacks. At first, the counterattacks failed. They tried to retake Douaumont on May 22nd, but on a major offensive, it didn't take. But they halted the German advance and started to push it off. By this time, the casualties were up to 200,000 on each side. If the Germans had started out, as is often said, with the objective of forcing the French to defend Verdun and bleeding the French army white, they succeeded only in the sense that they bled both armies. Robert Nivelle is kind of an interesting guy. He was from an Anglo-British family, which means he was bilingual. He did not go to Saint-Cyr. He went to the École Polytechnique. He was more of an engineer than he was a conventional army officer, and he rose up through the army artillery. Like Petain, he was promoted to brigadier general in 1914 and then took over the Verdun as a man with a reputation as an aggressive, knowledgeable commander who knew how to use artillery and who could conduct successful offensives. And indeed, he conducted, under his leadership, the French conducted counteroffensives starting in May and going on through to December, regaining much of the ground that had been lost during February, March, and early April. Subsequently, he's sort of an interesting character. He replaced Joffre as the supreme French commander in December of 1916. Now, you're thinking, why did they pick a guy who had been a brigadier general 2 years earlier and who was commanding an admittedly important part of the French army at Verdun, but who wasn't even an army group commander? Why did they put him in Joffre's job? Well, two things. First, he himself was convinced that by a combination of artillery tactics and infantry, he could win the war. And he'd been successful at Verdun. Second, politics. Joffre had a lot of enemies, and they basically all got together and said, we're going to throw Joffre out and we're going to put in this new guy, and we can control him and he will go win the war for us. And he was very persuasive. He actually believed that he could. Now, you can argue that he was never given full rein to use his methods, but that's probably not exactly right. He did carry out a major offensive in Champagne. The dates here are April 16th to May 9th, but honestly, the offensive lasted from April 16th to April 20th, at which point his political masters pulled the strings, and the rest of the offensive sort of petered out, ending formally on May 9th. It is now called the Nivelle Offensive. It was a miserable failure. The biggest problem with it was because the French army had been heavily demoralized by Verdun. Remember that half the French army had rotated through Verdun at one time or another. And then to be put into this failed offensive in Champagne a few months later induced a lot of the French soldiers to simply stay in place and refuse to do any offensive action. They would defend, but they wouldn't go forward. And this was called the French Mutiny. And the French army basically fell apart. So they brought in, the politicians at this point brought in Pétain, who was a known quantity and very popular with the French soldiers and was regarded as somebody that would take care of the soldiers, which he did. And he remained supreme commander of the French armies until the end of the war. All right. We're now continuing to talk about the third phase of the battle. The Germans, having had a tremendous amount of losses, began to conserve troops. Even the most aggressive corps commander had to admit that he was beginning to run out of people. After May 10th, give or take, the Germans were limited to just local attacks. And then, of course, after July 1st, the Germans had to begin moving troops to the Somme. And this affected Verdun in two ways. The first was that they no longer had a stream of replacements coming in to replace casualties. Probably the lack of replacements was the main reason that the Germans stopped doing very much in the way of attacking during the third phase. And then, of course, they actually had to move whole units to the Somme and take a lot of the supply and logistic support for Verdun and transfer it to the Somme, which was for the Germans a huge battle. And you'll notice from the map, here is Verdun, and here is the Somme. There's just no way if you're going to support this, and you're going to move your rail traffic, and you're going to move your logistics effort, and you're going to move your troop replacements and bring in new units. This has got to suffer. So that's really what happened to the Germans at this point. Now, the fourth phase then is from July 1st to the end of the battle. Both the French and the German lost troops to the Somme, but the Germans' last gasp, sort of, was a major attack on July 11th to take Fort Souville, which was one of the forts in the inner ring, which was basically the heights of the Meuse. And this failed. There was further fighting into August, but the German forces mostly went on the defensive. And on August 29th, Falkenhayn was then replaced as supreme German commander by von Hindenburg. As I mentioned earlier, Falkenhayn then went ahead to conquer Romania, and von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, of course, went on to lose the overall war. But that's a whole other story. From the standpoint of Verdun, the French counterattacks began to be successful. In October, Douaumont was recaptured to great celebration, and on November 5th, Fort Vaux which was another of the outer ring forts that had been captured in the early part of the battle. Fort Vaux was retaken on November 5th. And there was a further offensive in December, advancing north and west. And at that point, the Germans in that area pretty much collapsed. There's a famous comment. The German officer had complained that the prisoners were not being taken care of very well. And the officer in charge, the French officer in charge, said, "We do regret it, but we really didn't expect so many of you." There was a new French line from Bézenvaux to Côte de Poivre. Now, I'm sure all of you recognize that, but just in case you don't, I'll show it to you on a map. Here is the position of the of the front line of the German army at the start of this series of offensives. Here in October, November, and December. Here we are on October 10th, and you can see Fort Douaumont has just been recaptured. And here we are on November 11th. And then further on, December 15th to December 7th, September 18th, actually. And this is that new line extending along like this, which will remain the frontier pretty much for the rest of the war. There's the Côte de Poivre, and here is Bézenvaux, just in case you're interested. Now, this looks great, and it cemented Nivelle's reputation as a strong offensive general. Perhaps that's a bad way to put it. I don't think he was personally offensive, as a strong attacking general, shall we say. But if you look at the overall picture, please, here is what happened. This was the line on 21 February 1916. It didn't take the Germans very long to make this advance, but by 6 September, they were hung up trying to take Hill 304, Le Mort-Homme, Hill 365, etc. On the east bank of the Meuse, they made it to here by 26 February, and then they continued offensive operations mostly in March and April. And they finally, by 6 September, you see them down here. That's kind of the high water mark. But they're still not in Verdun. Here's Douaumont, here's Vaux. But you can see all of these little all these little pentagons that are forts, and all these little red circles that are batteries. And there's still a lot of defense left in this inner ring of defensive forts, and a lot of troops to man them. So this really represented the best the Germans could do. And as the French counterattacked and began to push back, they finally made it back here on 15 December. So by some measures, they regained about half of what they had lost on the east bank of the Meuse. And the German offensive was never as successful as they wanted it to be on the west bank. Notice, interestingly enough, that this is Montfaucon, and those of you that are familiar with the Meuse-Argonne offensive in 1918 will recognize this as one of the places where the American army fought as they were coming in from the southwest in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And even today, there's a major American monument in Montfaucon, just 20 miles from Verdun. Thus underlining how crucial this area was to the entire war. What sort of conditions did the soldiers fight under? Well, that's an interesting thing. You can see here some propaganda views This is a wonderfully posed and colorized picture showing soldiers with absolutely clean uniforms leaning on a parapet, pointing their rifles toward the enemy, except for this guy, he's looking at the cameraman. And all these guys are standing up with their binoculars. Now, think about this for a minute. This is World War One. You got trenches. Now, here are these guys standing out in the open looking through their binoculars. How long would they have lasted? And here's a picture of an idealized trench showing the evacuation of a wounded man and all of these people, clean uniforms, sitting around, getting ready to deal with the enemy. Right. Here's a picture of the glories of combat. You can see this guy has a bandage on his head, but he's still throwing a grenade. This one's stabbing with a knife. These guys are doing a bayonet charge. This guy's just swinging his weapon like a club. It's just all nonsense. I think this was intended to show the recapture of Fort Douaumont. Again, at Verdun, like every other battle in the war, the number of bayonet injuries were less than 2%, and virtually nobody did bayonet charges with any success. Now, what's the realism here? That's the realism. Here's a bunch of soldiers sitting there in a wet trench, doing the best they can to stay dry. It looks like they've been wading through mud, which is what they have been doing. And for sure, they're all keeping their heads well down below the parapet. Here's another group of French soldiers. Again, they're huddled down in their trenches. They've got their little dugouts here that they can shelter in. It is not an inspiring or encouraging thing. And I think the only reason that the French army made it through this was because they had set up a rotation so that nobody had to spend 10 months in this kind of condition. And here's a stirring cavalry charge. You can easily see that this would be irresistible on the battlefield. This is a rear area. I think the only person that looks happy here is the dog wrapped around the neck of a guy wearing, of course, a beret. This is the wound. This is care of the wounded. This is an aid station in a tunnel. Notice this guy who really looks like he's about on his last legs. If you look carefully, he's got a Red Cross armband. This isn't one of the wounded. This is one of the guys giving the care. He's probably a stretcher bearer, but who knows? He looks like he's on his last legs. And this is what Verdun itself looked like. Here's a group of soldiers going through what's left of Verdun during the battle. So let us talk about logistics, because this is one of the few battles in which the logistics themselves became one of the heroes of the battle. Logistics includes troop movement, horses, weapons, and ammunition. It includes food, water, supply, fodder, and just all kinds of supplies. It includes medical as well as medical supplies, but also medical evacuation and the movement of medical troops, and obviously communication. So, what were the challenges? Here you can see um, the line of trucks going all the way back. Here you can see a group of infantry coming forward and a group of what looks like infantry heading back. Troops were moving both ways constantly during this battle. The troops that had been in the trenches for 2 or 3 weeks were being rotated out, and the troops that were replacing them would come in. Notice that this is all trucks. By the time of the Battle of Verdun, they had enough trucks and they were reliant enough on them so that they could use trucks to pretty much do all of their troop movement and supplies. And we'll get to that in a moment. Now, this is an important slide because it illustrates that Verdun is surrounded on three sides, and there is a limit to exactly where they can bring supplies. The East West Railroad, which would wind up in Paris, has been cut because the Germans have artillery in this area and here that could actually the cut the rail lines and did. Notice here's Somme to give you an idea. This is about from here to here is about 20 miles. On the west bank, you can see that the Germans are in control all the way down here, in particular in Saint Mihiel. Because they're in control, the railroad from Nancy to Verdun is unusable. The river is unusable. In fact, the only place that they could get a supply route established was from the little town of Bardeloup, which was the terminus of another east-west railroad, to Verdun. And there wasn't even a railroad, there was a road here. This railroad here is actually a light rail system that paralleled the road that was put in as the battle developed. But the first line of supply was the road, which has become known as the Sacred Way, the Voie Sacrée. From Bar-le-Duc to Verdun is 45 miles. Through some miracle of foresight, or possibly just an accident, they actually widened the road in 1915 to 23 feet, which meant that it could take traffic in both directions. Pétain, under Pétain's leadership, it was divided into 8 segments. Each segment had its own garrison, basically 2 battalions. It had repair shops. It had there were a total of 16 labor battalions. They started running 600 trucks per day, but by the middle of March, they could run up to 240 or 250 trucks per hour. They simply, if a truck broke down, had a flat tire, became inoperable, they would simply pull them off to the side and drag them to one of the repair shops and fix it up. If they had troops out there literally all day, every day, repairing the road, putting new surfacing on, doing whatever they can to keep the road going. It was a tremendous effort. It took 300 officers and 8,500 men to do this. They mobilized 3,500 trucks. This is one of the Berlioz trucks, which you can see here. By today's standards, it's not a very big truck, but it was big enough. The Renault trucks were about the same size. They had 800 ambulances going back and forth. Often these were Ford Model Ts because they were simply transporting people. They could be much lighter. And then they set up the narrow gauge railroad, which ran parallel to the Sacred Way. And here's a picture of it. This shows the individual stations, the individual garrisons along the segmentation of the road, so that each of these garrisons would be responsible to for its segment of the road and would be able to manage traffic, repair trucks, and do the road resurfacing for that. And this kept going for 10 months. The French were very aware that this had saved Verdun, and they, after the war, they established a series of kilometer stones. This shows the one at Bardeloup, showing the direction to Verdun. There's a French helmet on top of it, and you can see these milestones to this day. There's one every kilometer from Bardeloup to Verdun. And when have you ever seen a logistical supply route have its own memorial statue. Here it is on the road from Bartoluc to Verdun. The Bois Sacré exists today. It's now paved. It's still in use, of course, but it's the memories and the meaning of it for French for the French is still outstanding. The cost of Verdun: 700,000 casualties, 300,000 men were killed. On the French side and the German side, they were about equal. The Germans maybe lost a few more. Yes, they bled the French army white, and they bled themselves white. In terms of land gain, there was a net German advance, but it really wasn't significant. The morale effect on both sides was severe. We paid a lot of attention to the French and its adverse effect on the French and the effect on the subsequent French army mutinies. But the Germans weren't a whole lot better. The morale effect was severe and it damaged both sides quite severely. The French made a virtue of necessity and built this great ossuary. They had so many casualties, so many bones, that they didn't know what to do with them. They couldn't bury them as individuals. So they set up a great cemetery and this ossuary, which kind of looks inspiring in this tourist photo. This is probably a better picture of it. This is one I took from the back. You look through these windows here and see all the bones just laid out in this whole long building. And if you want, you can go through, and there's a little museum that you get to on the other side, and you can be still further depressed by that. Appropriately, the sky was quite gray the day I was visiting, so I think that this is, again, an appropriate picture. What was the effect of Verdun? It was tactically inconclusive. It was strategically very important. It tied up both the French and the German armies during 1916. It restricted the French forces at the Somme. It demoralized the French army, and it resulted in promotion of Nivelle to supreme command. What is the rule that everyone gets promoted to their level of incompetence? I think Nivelle probably illustrated that with the Champagne offensive in 1917, which was a total failure and led to the French mutinies. To summarize, then, the Battle of Verdun. The Germans attacked with the objective of forcing the French to defend something that was indefensible and to possibly be able to take Verdun and give themselves an invasion route into northern France that would bypass the existing trench lines. Whether that was actually their intent or not, it failed. You can see that they made it a good ways, but then lost about half of that ground and were left with ground which was essentially really not very important. Subsequently, then in 1918, when the Meuse-Argonne offensive started, the American army simply moved through this area to the northwest of Verdun, and the Germans were forced to retreat anyway. This remains an important part of French national mythology. Here's a video, for example, which I think the cover probably says all. Shows people dying heroically for La Patrie. Here's a monument to the dead of the 12th Division. There are monuments all over the Verdun battlefield. Here's the monument to Verdun in Verdun itself, and you can see that it's lit at night with the tricolor, the blue, white, and red of the French flag. Very beautiful memorial. The books I used for this, there's probably too many to count, but Paul Jankowski's Battle of Verdun and John Mosier's Battle of Verdun, I think are the two most worth reading. They aren't the same, and you'll get a different viewpoint from the two of them, but put them together, and I think they give you a pretty good picture of the battle. Does anyone have any questions?
Charlie, Jerry put in the chat, why did the Germans never effectively disrupt the Voie de Secret that led to Verdun?
It's not that they didn't try.
Yeah, they probably could reach it with their long artillery, I would think, but that would be it.
It was out of range of their tactical artillery. They had even their heavier guns, like their heavier howitzers, 150 millimeter guns, couldn't reliably hit that. And the salient looks narrow on the map, but it's about 20 miles wide. And the closest the German came would be to the Saint Mihiel salient, and they never really exploited the Saint Mihiel salient. I mean, perhaps a better question is, why didn't they just invade through that? They were already across the Meuse, and they could have come in through that, but they decided not to, which gives credence to the theory that their real purpose was to force the French to defend Verdun, and they were less concerned about actually breaking through. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. Thank you. Appreciate your thought.
Charlie, one book, from what I've read, it seemed that the Germans started out with that idea. They were going to bleed the French white by continuing to bombard them and let the French rotate their reserve troops in there and kill them off rather than take Verdun. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, yes, that may have been. Let me put it this way: it's possible that was Falkenhayn's original concept. As anyone who's been in the Army knows, an operation may start with the concept as laid out by the commanding general. By the time it gets down to the buck private, it may be a totally different concept entirely. And in this case, it's pretty clear that the corps commanders were in charge of what was actually going on the ground. And they just took the bit in their teeth. And they were by the Kaiser, they were going to capture Verdun.
Well, and some argue that Falkenhayn introduced that concept in his memoirs as kind of a afterthought to the bleed. I'm not sure it was discussed during the war as much as it came from his memoirs.
That's a very valid point. The information about and the quotation are post-war, and Falkenhayn was trying to justify what he actually did, which was to mount an incredibly large offensive that failed. I think it's equally likely that he had the idea that Verdun was, again, a natural invasion route. They may have known that the French had backed down on many of the defenses in Verdun. They certainly had spies and they had observation planes. They kind of knew what was going on. And I think it's equally possible that Falkenhayn started this whole thing with the idea that they would just roll over Verdun and that would eventually take them to Paris. Now, you could argue that that's not what they started out to do with their invasion through Belgium, but I remind you that Falkenhayn wasn't the guy that planned that. Moltke the Younger was the guy that planned and carried that out, and he got canned fairly early in the war and replaced by Falkenhayn, who may have thought that he had a better idea for winning the war. We may never know. All right.
Hey, Charlie, one more question. So why did the French, how do they justify taking their artillery and troops out of some of the fortresses, since they had such an array of fortresses there? And it seems rather ironic when you consider the Maginot Line in the Second World War. But you may have covered it, but
I don't know. They were converting from something based on big fortresses to something more like a linear row, a linear operation with multiple strong points. So they didn't completely abandon the forts. As it turned out, they did completely abandon Fort Douaumont, and nobody's really very sure.
Yeah.
Certainly, Driant tried to call a halt to that. He brought that up to the Ministry of War, but really nobody paid a lot of attention to it. They were convinced that this was a quiet sector, and apparently they believed their own propaganda. I don't know. Bruce,
Yeah.
you have a comment?
Yes, it was on one of those propaganda photos you showed us of guys in the trench looking over the top with a shocha, I think, in the background. But two of the men in the photo were wearing khaki and had Brody helmets on. So where on earth was that photo staged?
Who knows?
Uh,
I think it probably was not staged at Verdun.
yeah.
Were they American? Because the Americans would be wearing a more of an earthen tone with the Brody helmet.
Mm.
I didn't notice them there, but that may be the answer.
Well, of course, remember that the picture was subsequently colorized. I doubt it was a color picture. Might have been.
No, but the helmets definitely stood out as being different.
They did. They were.
Yeah.
Personally, I think whoever did that simply assembled a group of people and dressed them up, and who knows if they were even soldiers, and put them in whatever uniforms they had around the photo studio. Well, be that as it may. Well, thank you all for your attention, and I appreciate your coming to hear my thoughts about Verdun.